So this lecture is going to be on Christianity, the classical phase. Before I do that, I'd just like to briefly reflect on the fact of cultural illiteracy and why, if many people were asked what they know about the classical phase of Christianity from pretty well the 1st to the 7th century, why there is no memory of that, and what does that say about minimally educated people that have no understanding of the past, no background in the past. Just as I've looked at earlier, the Greek tradition, elements of the Roman tradition, the Jewish tradition. So the early Christian tradition also suffers from exactly the same deficit in terms of cultural literacy. I mean, we are literate in that we can read, but most people today are culturally illiterate in that they have no background or history in terms of thousands of years of intellectual, social, literary, political, economic history. And so even though we talk about the opening of the mind, diversity and pluralism, if people have no background at all, then these become empty slogans, cliches. They mean nothing because there's no sense of what you're pluralist about or what diversity is all about other than the thinnest understanding of the word, or just people become dilettantes or voyeurs. So words are thrown around like frisbees, but they have no substance or meaning anymore. So what might be some of the reasons that people have no sense of the past, no understanding of early Christianity, its complex nature, as in any history of any organization? Well, first of all, and I've mentioned this in some of my other courses and lectures, the Hegelian notion of progressive notion of history is that this idea that history always moves forward in a better and better, more enlightened way. This is where we get the language of the Enlightenment. There's the Middle Ages, or some would call it the Dark Ages. So there's this prejudice, or what C.S. Lewis would call chronological snobbery, and that somehow those further along in evolving history are more enlightened, more insightful. They understand things better, whereas the past was not quite as bright or quite as informed or quite as wise as we. There's obviously a real sense of paternalism in such an outlook, but it's this Hegelian sense, evolving this notion of evolution, that humans are ever evolving in a better manner. Civilizations are becoming wiser. We're growing out of the dark ages of the past through the dialectic of history and this whole Hegelian notion of moving forward. So if history is one of progress and enlightenment, why would we even care, other than it's a museum culture, about the past in any minimal way? So one wing of the Enlightenment takes the position in terms of history as progress. History is moving forward, hence a minimal understanding of the past is quite secondary to moving meaningfully into the future on a whole range of substantive personal as well as political interests. One wing of the Enlightenment I have talked about earlier, and this is the second element, which of course Hegel would differ with, but there are three wings or traditions, small t traditions, within the capital T tradition Enlightenment. One is the right wing of the Enlightenment, which was very scientific, rationalist, empirical, logical, mathematical, and so that tended to take a position, the extreme right, when it came to religion, that again was a part of the evolving Enlightenment, was that religion was something we were moving beyond. Hence, why would we study the past other than a lower level of human development and evolution? And out of that comes the ideology of secularism, in terms of the sacred is something we're moving beyond, so why study it at all other than a phase, a season of human unfolding? But we are we're adults now. We're not children. We're in the adult phase of human development. So the teen or the early adult or the young phase of human development is something we need not reflect on too deeply, because we've grown out of that. So secularism is a child of a form of rationalism, the right wing of the Enlightenment. I might add the other two traditions of the Enlightenment, which I briefly discussed earlier, is the Romantic wing of the Enlightenment, which was certainly not anti-religious. It wasn't even a-religious. It saw religion and spirituality as an essential part of the human journey, and there were other ways of knowing beyond a certain understanding of reason. There was intuition, there was myth, there was symbol, there was human desire. And many romantics argued that most people, for most part, their longings for meaning are pretty thin and pretty shallow, and people don't go deep enough in the nature of longing itself for something deeper and more substantive. So they inevitably, in their thirst or hunger for meaning, they just turn to shallow or transient or irrelevant things which will leave them restless. So the Romantic wing of the Enlightenment was deeply religious. It never opposed religion in any substantive sense. And then the humanist wing of the Enlightenment was also, Hegel would come out of that, and Kant would come out of that, and England, the Romantics like Coleridge would come out of that great tradition as well, or Goethe in Germany. You could go through many of the great countries. The humanist wing of these were not anti-religious. But one wing of the Enlightenment, a certain version of the rationalist, I might say that many people who are committed to the importance of reasons are not necessarily anti-religious, but it is a wing of which today you'll get things like the new atheists or something. They're coming out of that extreme right wing of the scientistic wing, and I might add that many scientists are not also anti-religious also, but there are also people who are. So one reason, of course, building on this dialectic of progressive notion of history, one interpretation of that is secularism contra the sacred, science versus religion. And so if a person buys into that position, then why bother studying the history of Christianity, the history of Judaism, the history of Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Sikh tradition, any of those things? Because surely as adults, mature adults, we've grown beyond that. So there is this merging then in Western intellectual thought between a progressive notion of history moving in a certain direction which Hegel would not have gone, but the secular wing of progressive notion of the Enlightenment leading to secularism, and that then leads to a certain suspicion, skepticism of religion itself. And so then the issue of Christianity, as we're moving in this course slowly from the richness and wisdom of the best of the Greek tradition, earlier the Jewish tradition, its clash between propheticism and nationalism, the Roman tradition, of which you would have looked at previous week in Scott's book and Scott's lecture. We're now moving into the Christian tradition itself and the rise of Christianity. I might also, as a third element that often has led to the undermining of the 1st to 7th century of the Christian tradition, is a certain form of Protestant Christianity. In the 16th century, of course, many of the reformers were steeped in the greater tradition, but their followers, of course, are a lesser breed, and but certainly a Luther and a Calvin, best of the Anabaptists, Mennonites, certainly many of them come out of Catholic tradition, so they knew the heritage. But when you move 2 or 3 centuries forward, people who then come out of these forms of Christianity, which it's back to the Bible, the Bible, the Bible. And so why learn anything about 1,500 years of history? Because that's just a distortion, it's a perversion of pure, true Christianity. And so a certain form of Protestantism emerging in the 16th century, and then accelerating by 17th, 18th, and many forms of Protestantism today, have also contributed to this lack of an understanding of the early centuries of Christianity as well. So there is this Protestantism, the emergence of it via evangelical tradition, which is even more ahistorical than the early reformers of the 16th century. The Enlightenment, the right wing of the Enlightenment, just as Protestants deconstructed Catholicism, right wing of the Enlightenment deconstructed Christianity. And French Revolution is a classic case of a certain political secularism which deconstructs Christianity. And of course it's that feeds into Marxism a little later in terms of the rise of the Soviet Union. Marx interpreted in a certain way. So there are all these prejudices in modern and elements of postmodern thought that bends people in a direction of why would we learn about early Christianity, classical Greek thought, Roman thought, Jewish thought. And so it leaves them illiterate culturally in terms of, and so then discussions, when people start talking about Christianity is this or Christianity is that, you want to say, well, how well have you read any of the great Christian philosophers of the 1st to the 7th centuries, or theologians, or political activists, or political theorists, or economists, and they'll look back at you, they don't even know the names of what the issues are. So it's this amnesia, or what I've called memoricide, lack of memory entirely, and memory, Noam Chomsky once says memory is a form of intellectual self-defense. And without memory, people their minds can be twisted and made to believe anything, and it's only memory and being grounded in thousands of years of culture and civilization, and people make these crude comments about the West, or Plato, Aristotle, Christianity. You want to say, how deeply have you read any of this stuff or immersed in it? And most people, it's nothing, and so you get these silly comments that are not worthy even of discussion of people. So there are all these prejudices or prejudgments that often are very, very much with us. And of course, people, when retreat from the big issues of life, they inevitably then live for small issues, little issues that are really quite insignificant, and they go round and round chasing their tails with things that just leave them restless for more amusements, more diversions in that sense. So when we come to the classical phase of Christianity, it can be divided into 3 distinct sections from the 1st up to the 7th century. And I'm just going to touch on a few elements of that before we get to Augustine. In a couple of weeks we'll get into Augustine's writing. But Augustine comes 4th, 5th century, so we got to cover these early phases of Christianity. So we can divide it into 3 sections. There would be obviously the biblical phase, and the Bible itself was not fully canonized till the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, and so, but obviously if a person comes from a Protestant perspective, there's a tendency to think the Bible had somehow dropped like a United Parcel Service in the 1st century, and it was always there, but that's projecting the present onto the past. If you're going from the past forward, these texts of the Hebrew canon, or Christians call the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, and the New Testament, these are foundational. Then there's, so it's the textual phase, the biblical phase. Then there's what's called the post-apostolic phase. Inevitably, Jesus, the disciples, they die. That's just a given. So how is Christianity, how did it continue to move out of the Mediterranean area? Who are the thinkers? Who are the women? Who are the men who are a part of that? And then there's the patristic phase from about the 2nd, 3rd century up to the 7th, where you had some of the most sophisticated thinkers in late antique thought. Now, just a few comments I want to make to look at some of this, and then some of the lectures in the future will go in this in more detail. Christianity did emerge out of the Jewish tradition, and hence to understand Christianity, that is an important element to know, i.e. the history of the Jewish tradition is embodied in the Hebrew canon and then the Apocrypha. But many of the early followers of Jesus, as they moved out into a classical world, that was not a world that knew a lot about Judaism. It didn't have a lot of interest in Judaism. These were women and men who had been raised in classical Greek thought. Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Seneca. And so what would draw them to Christianity if they had, one, no interest in the Jewish tradition, and how were people who were interested in the bigger questions of life and the human journey, what would draw them to Christianity? There were 2 traditions in Christianity which emerged. One was the Tertullian phase or the Tatian phase tradition, that what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What has the academy to do with the church? And so thinking and learning, that's something that we are not going to spend a lot of time thinking or worrying about. There's the revelatory truth that comes through the sacred texts embodied in Jesus, and the other things are lower truths, truths that really are not worth spending one's time with. And so there is no revelatory insight in other cultures and civilizations. That was the minor tradition in Christianity. The major traditions emerging certainly in biblical texts, but also in the first great center of Christian thought, Alexandria, biggest library in the ancient world, was that all civilizations, all cultures had what was called the logos spermaticos. The seed of eternity was within each person, within each civilization, whether it's the Celts in what was to become England, Albion, whether it was in India, whether it was in Asia, whether it was in Africa. And so this belief that just as the Jewish tradition was a preparation for the coming of Christ, so the best of Indian philosophy and spirituality, the Druids in Albion, all of these classical Greek thought, Plato, Aristotle, Roman thought, all of these civilizations were in their different, where they had the seeds of truth, and to the degree people listened deeply within themselves to their more profound longings for meaning, and were not cynics or skeptics. Interestingly enough, one of the great battles that Plato and Aristotle had was again and again against the sophists. And as Athens had declined and the sophists came to dominate, the skeptics and Protagoras and people like this, they were constantly deconstructing. And you always know when a civilization is collapsing, essentially, or coming near its end, because cynicism, skepticism comes to dominate in regards to religion and politics and community and truth and meaning. And then then the next step, if you're cynical about the big important things in life, what do people then indulge in? Well, there's the whole amusement factories, the bread and circuses of ancient Rome. Or let's get an education so we can be paid well and just indulge our appetites with possessions and property and expensive vacations. So, because there's no point in thinking or living about anything meaningful, ultimate, or what that means in the penultimate. So we just indulge appetites of various kinds. So when Plato and Aristotle were grappling with these issues as Athens began to deteriorate, they were attempting to construct or think through thought, word, and deed, a vision worth living for. And this is why the early Christians, as they came along, were deeply indebted to the sophisticated thinking of Plato and Aristotle, which you don't get in the biblical tradition at all. And so it's through this, many of the early Christians from Alexandria and Antioch, Constantinople, Rome, Jerusalem as well, there was this sense of how does the early Christian tradition heed and hear the very wisest and best of all the great civilizations in the Mediterranean and beyond itself? And it was this notion of common grace, or logos spermaticos, and philosophia, the love of wisdom itself. So Alexandria was the great center of that, and Origen and Clement. Again, if you ask many people what they know about Christianity and what do they know of Origen, for example, he would be writing 4 books at a time. His secretaries, he'd be wandering down in the scriptorium of Alexandria, lecturing on the Bible and exegesis. He'd be lecturing on philosophy, another book on theology, another book on ecclesiology. And so Origen published 50, 60 books in his lifetime, and Clement before him. The school of Alexandria was a great center of learning, and as I mentioned, the greatest library in the ancient world was in Alexandria. So early Christianity in its post-biblical phase, the post-apostolic of Polycarp and Irenaeus and Shepherd of Hermy, many of these great texts engaged the declining Roman Empire in a way that drew the very best from it, but also critiqued its blindnesses and its indulgences and tried to build a civilization on the ashes, really, of a dying Roman Empire. As some of the leading politicians were ruthless, they were imperialistic. It was the church that came to critique them. I might also add at a political level, so at a philosophical level, you have the early Christianity very much engaging the very best of a classical civilization. At a political level, most of the early Christians refused to bow to Caesar, and underneath all of that, they just did not believe in the notion of genuflecting to an empire, to an aggressive imperial force. And it's ironic today where you get many Christians, say, across the border that uncritically genuflect to the imperial nature of the United States, which in many ways is just like a new Rome. The early Christians took a very strong position that the kingdom of God was more ultimate, and when Rome or the United States insisted on their allegiance and a refusal of citizens to critique the empire, it was early Christians that said that peace and justice, and there are standards here that transcend unjust, unpeaceful imperial aggression as Rome spread throughout the Mediterranean, of course, to India, up into England, through Europe, in other parts of the world, and the devastation and havoc that was wreaked on peoples and tribes and clans that didn't fit into that aggressive imperial mode. So it was the early Christians who were very engaged publicly, whether it was holding high the role of women in leadership, slaves, again, and within a classical culture, you'll get slavery was almost an institution which could not be questioned. Well, it was Christianity with this notion of the equality of all people before God, and how that then was played out in the political, social, economic sphere. Some of the early popes in the early church had been former slaves, in fact. Some of the leaders in the early church were women. And so two groups of people in classical Roman thought, and even elements of Greek thought, women and slaves, were given a front stage in early Christianity. So at the political level, the aggressive militarism of Rome was many Christians, actually thousands, who died as martyrs for daring to question where that militarism led, the unjust treatment of people who wouldn't bow the knee to Rome. And so many of the martyrs, of the thousands who died in the Colosseum, were people who believed that justice and peace in the kingdom of God stood above imperial ambitions, and they died for that. As Christians eventually came to take leadership role in the declining Roman Empire, it was they, for example, like Ambrose in the West, or even an Augustine, who we'll get to in a couple of weeks, that stood up to emperors. Chrysostom in the East, Basil in the East, or the Orthodox wing of Christianity. You get this whole notion that the great Christian bishops and archbishops again and again would not even allow emperors into cathedrals or into churches if they had been engaged in violence, if they'd been engaged in injustice or peacemaking or warmongering. They stood and stared them in the face, and they could not even come into the sanctuary until they offered reparations for what they had done. So politically, just as philosophically, you had early Christianity was engaged at a fairly substantive level in grappling with the larger issues of why are we here, what's the purpose of life, what's the nature of desire, shallow desire, substantive desire, what happens when people indulge lesser desires, when their hungers are not deep enough, and then they long for shallow issues. And so how does one order desire, called the ordo amoros, the ordering of our loves, so they're directed toward meaningful things that lead to a deeper centeredness and stillness and quietness. So the philosophical, theological journey, which was certainly central to the emergence of Christianity and rebuilding a civilization which was collapsing on the foundations of cynicism and skepticism, and also a brutal way of treating other people. It was Christianity that came along philosophically and offered a vision worth living for, and then politically a way of living that vision that was much more about justice and peacekeeping. And certainly the Beatitudes became foundational to something like that as well. We'll look at how Augustine next week grappled with some of these issues in the 4th and 5th centuries at a philosophical, theological, exegetical level, and that at a political, economic, and social level, as Rome, for the most part, was totally unraveling, as the Goths and Visigoths were essentially the Goths and Visigoths were essentially victims of Roman imperialism, and the time had come when they were ceasing to be that. And of course they were called the terrorists, but they had been terrorized for centuries by Rome itself, and they were now fighting back. And just as people who have been colonized fight back are called terrorists, when in fact they've been terrorized. And so the Goths and Visigoths were doing the same thing at their time, but often we see Rome through the eyes of the imperial eyes, and then the Goths and Visigoths are seen as the enemies of civilization, but set in a historic context. The history and the reality is much more complex. So this is a bit of the beginning of the emergence of classical Christianity. I've lightly touched down on the classical phase, which is biblical, post-apostolic, and patristic. Briefly mentioned the Alexandrian tradition, which is the very apex of, as Christianity moved out of the Palestine, Jerusalem context, they inevitably encountered a classical civilization, and so the leading Christian philosophers, theologians, thinkers, political activists, political theorists had to think, what is attractive about Christianity in terms of its appeal? What does it evoke in the human soul for meaning, for purpose, and who are the women and men and former slaves who were at the forefront of building a civilization as one was collapsing and decaying and falling to pieces. And so to understand that classical phase is to understand the decaying and the destruction, and then the creative urge at work in patristic Christianity that really built what was to become Christendom as a civilization at its best, of which we have inherited, and elements also of its worst as well. But at this early phase, the big issue was civilization was collapsing. Sophists and skeptics, that's all they could think was the breakdown of everything, and all they could do was deconstruct. The early Christian community both deconstructed what had to pass away, but creatively they were constructing and laying the foundations for a whole new civilization in the arts and culture and literature and music and great buildings and philosophy and theology. And it's at this period of time that this creative work went on, and to some degree Western civilization, Europe and North America, is the heir of that, the best of it, and as I mentioned earlier as well, some elements of the worst of it, which we will return to next week.